consider we're really in some unusual times. I don't think most people realize how blessed we are. There it is. Can you hear that better? Okay. I don't think most Americans realize how blessed we are. We take so much for granted. Let me just point out the average length of a constitution in the history of the world is 17 years. America's had ours for 233 years. It's what we have, we just take for granted. We've had it for so long, we just assume it's always going to be there. That's not the case. I've talked to people, we take congressional delegations to Poland, help with congressional delegations, setting up relations with the conservative nations in Europe, and I've talked to people in Poland who have lived through 7 constitutions in their lifetime. If you're from South Korea, since South Korea was free, they've been through 6 constitutions. So we have one, we've been very blessed. I think the reason is John Adams put his finger on it. He said, we're a government of laws, not of men. It's not the opinions of people that guide us, it is written documents that guide us. And so those written documents have been very key. When you look at those written documents, they don't change over generations. They give us principles. If you look at scientific principles, the principles of gravity don't change, the laws of gravity, the laws of motion, none of those laws change. Same with the Constitution. It's not written on technology, it's written on principles that do not change across time. And as you understand those principles, that gives longevity to what we do. Now, every elected official we have in America, from dog catcher through President of the United States, takes an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. The problem is, most Americans today don't know the Constitution. Let me give some stats. Right now in America, what the easiest citizen question should be, how many branches of government are they and what are they? Legislative, executive, judicial. 3, right? Only 24% of Americans can name the 3 branches of government. Among elected officials, 48% of elected officials cannot tell you the 3 branches of government. That's the most basic question that there is. We have found recently, in recent weeks, that 57% of Americans have never read the Constitution of the United States. It's really hard to defend something and protect something or uphold something you don't know what it is. You've never read it. So that's where we have to start, is knowing what our rights are. And as you know the rights, there's no way you can understand the Constitution without understanding the Declaration. It's interesting that in American federal law, there are 4 what they call organic documents. Right at the start of all the legal code in America, it lists the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution as 2 of those 4. So you can't ignore the Declaration, because the Declaration sets forth 6 principles of government, and those 6 principles they took to the Constitution in the Constitution. Now, I'm not going to go through the 6 principles, but I want to draw to your attention. The Declaration says that there are certain inalienable rights that we have, and that the purpose of government is to protect inalienable rights. Now, when you look at inalienable rights, how many are there? Well, the Founding Fathers identified roughly 24 inalienable rights. There's 16 to 19 that are embedded in the Bill of Rights and the Declaration, but they have about 24 or so of those inalienable rights. And I think there's easy to say that those inalienable rights are under attack today. And they're under attack by so many who don't even have a clue what they are. They think they can set aside free speech or religion or press or well, I'll talk about press in a minute. But they think they can set aside those rights kind of arbitrarily for the sake of a pandemic that's come through. And let me point out, these are not unprecedented times in America in many ways. If you study history, we've had a major pandemic about every 15 to 18 years throughout American history. You can start back 1633 with the yellow fever pandemic, the smallpox. You can go to yellow fever. We've had scarlet fever pandemics. We've had measles pandemics. We've had several cholera pandemics. We've had all sorts of different flu epidemics. I mean, there's so many. So this is nothing new. And by the way, point out, as much as we're hearing about how lethal this thing is, if you go to the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, the mortality rate in cities like Philadelphia was 25%. So let me set the stage here. There's 2.64 million people in Dallas County. If we had had the same mortality rate they had in the yellow fever epidemic of 1793, we would have 600,000 Dallas Countyans dead right now. We have 111 dead. This is nowhere close to the mortality of previous epidemics. What's necessary to make us a happy and a prosperous people? He says, a wise and frugal government that shall leave citizens free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is a sum of good government. So good government gives you the right to earn a living and doesn't take it away from you. Now, that's a fundamental understanding they had. Now, let me be real clear. It's not the government's responsibility to give you a job or to make sure you have a job. You do that. But once you get a job, it's the government's responsibility not to take it away from you and to make sure that you can keep the income that you make. That's not their responsibility to give you a job. So So that right to have a job and earn a living is fundamentally an inalienable right. If you understand the Declaration, the purpose of government is to protect inalienable rights. That's what the Constitution guarantees. So that should have been done all along. Shutting businesses down this way is unprecedented. That is the one thing that's never happened in any previous pandemic, is complete closure of business. It's never happened before. That's what's unprecedented, but then we know less of the Constitution today than in any previous generation. So we've allowed it, we put up with it. You really can't do that. So let me close with a couple of quotes. One quote comes from George Washington. George Washington, as he was leaving public office after leading in some way in America, militarily, politically, some way, for 40 years in America, as he's going out of office after 2 terms as president, this is what he reminded us. It's really a warning, if you will. He says, it is important that the habits of thinking in a free country, and free country, you need to have free thinking habits, you need to think freely. He says it's important that the habits of a free country should inspire caution in elected officials, that they confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres. Amen. He said the spirit of encroachment, that is the spirit to go beyond what's constitutional, tends to create a real despotism. It's a great warning. You stay within the Constitution, your freedoms are guaranteed. You get without that, you start losing your freedoms. But again, it goes back to knowing the Constitution. And again, we don't teach that in schools like we used to. We don't have the civic stuff we used to. Americans don't know it. So here's the final quote I'll give you. It's a challenge, if you will. And by the way, let me point out that this stuff is being litigated. We talked to an attorney yesterday who now has legal action going in 40 different states. He's a Supreme Court attorney. We work with so many national legal groups that are so aggressive on this, and we got a decision 2 days ago on one of the government officials who was trying to suspend rights. This is what the Circuit Court of Appeals said. I love this. They said, we will not allow the Constitution to sleep during this pandemic. Exactly right. And I'll tell you, those 191 judges that have been appointed in the last 3 years, they're more constitutionalists than I've seen in my lifetime. And those are the guys that are starting to give this kind of decision. So they're looking at the Constitution first. However, here's the final quote I have from me. It comes from John Jay. He's an author of the Federalist Papers, one of the greatest commentaries ever written on the Constitution. He's an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. Here's what he advised in his day. He says, every member of the state ought diligently to read and study the Constitution of his country and to teach the rising generation to be free. He said, by knowing their rights, they will sooner perceive when their rights are violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. 7 verbs there. Read and study the Constitution and teach it. Then know your rights so that you can perceive when they're violated, and then you can defend and assert your rights. Those 7 verbs, that's a quote that every one of us should memorize. As a citizen of the United States, we need to know our Constitution. We need to teach it to the next generation. It is knowing, defending, and asserting our rights that has made America different from every other nation in the world. We've got to keep doing that today. God bless you guys.